On May 2, 2026, thousands of travelers opened their phones expecting ordinary travel updates. Instead, many found a message no passenger wants to receive. Their Spirit Airlines flight had been canceled. Across the United States, passengers discovered that every scheduled Spirit flight had been stopped. The airline instructed customers not to come to airports, aircraft remained parked, and travel plans that had been made weeks or months earlier suddenly disappeared. But on that morning, Spirit Airlines was no longer focused on growth. It was fighting to survive. To passengers, the shutdown appeared sudden. But the final cancellation was not the beginning of Spirit's crisis. It was the visible result of years of financial pressure, difficult decisions, and a series of failed attempts to keep the airline alive. Behind the canceled flights were thousands of employees who had spent years keeping the airline in the air. Pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, and airport workers were now facing an uncertain future. So how did one of America's largest low-cost airlines reach a point where continuing normal operations was no longer possible? The answer began years earlier, with the business model that made Spirit famous. For years, Spirit Airlines built its identity around one simple idea: make air travel cheaper by operating differently from traditional airlines. Its ultra-low-cost model allowed passengers to find some of the lowest fares in the industry. But that model depended on efficiency. Aircraft needed to keep flying, costs had to remain tightly controlled, and unexpected financial pressure could quickly become difficult to absorb. As expenses increased and competition became more challenging, Spirit needed a way to strengthen its future. One possible solution appeared in the form of a merger with JetBlue Airways. The proposed $3.8 billion acquisition was expected by Spirit leadership to provide a stronger financial position and a better chance to compete in a changing airline industry. But in January 2024, a federal judge blocked the deal, and the merger was eventually abandoned. The opportunity disappeared. Spirit was forced to continue on its own. The failed JetBlue deal did not immediately end the airline's story, but it removed one of the most important options Spirit had available. From that moment forward, the company entered a much more difficult fight, one where every remaining solution mattered. The JetBlue merger was gone. For Spirit, that meant losing what many had viewed as the clearest path toward a more stable future. But the airline was not ready to give up. Instead, Spirit entered a new phase of survival. The company turned toward restructuring, hoping that reducing financial pressure would give it enough time to rebuild. The goal was simple: create a smaller, more sustainable airline that could continue serving passengers while recovering from years of financial strain. For a moment, survival still appeared possible. But restructuring could only solve part of the problem. An airline cannot pause its expenses while it tries to recover. Aircraft still require maintenance. Employees still need to be paid. Leased airplanes still create costs whether they are flying or sitting on the ground. And then, another challenge made the situation even harder. Fuel prices began rising sharply. For any airline, fuel is one of the largest operating expenses. But for a carrier already fighting to stabilize its finances, a sudden increase in costs could change the entire calculation. Spirit needed more time. It also needed more financial support. The airline was no longer just trying to become profitable again. It was trying to secure enough liquidity to keep operating while it searched for a long-term solution. That is when one more possibility emerged. A final rescue effort offered a chance that Spirit could continue flying instead of moving toward shutdown. It represented another attempt to keep the airline alive after previous options had disappeared. But the rescue was not guaranteed. Behind the scenes, difficult decisions had to be made. The company needed a solution that could satisfy the different groups involved while providing enough support to continue operations. And once again, the path forward became harder. The rescue effort failed. The JetBlue deal was gone. The restructuring effort had not created enough stability. And the final attempt to secure a way forward had also disappeared. By this point, Spirit's problem was no longer just financial losses. The airline still had aircraft. It still had experienced employees. It still had passengers who wanted affordable travel. But an airline cannot survive on airplanes alone. It needs the financial ability to keep those airplanes in the air. And Spirit had reached the point where the remaining options were running out. The shutdown that followed would appear sudden to the outside world. But inside the company, it was the result of a long series of decisions, setbacks, and failed attempts to find one more way forward. When Spirit's final flights were canceled, the impact was felt far beyond passengers searching for another way to reach their destinations. For the travelers who had planned their trips around Spirit's schedule, the shutdown created immediate uncertainty. Flights that had once appeared routine were suddenly gone, leaving passengers searching for refunds, replacements, and answers from an airline that was no longer operating normally. But the people most affected were the employees who had built their careers around keeping those aircraft in the air. Pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, and countless other workers had spent years maintaining the daily operation of the airline. For them, this was not simply a change in a schedule or a temporary disruption. It was the collapse of the workplace they depended on. Airports that had once been filled with Spirit aircraft, crew movements, and regular departures entered a different reality. Planes remained parked. Crews were no longer preparing for normal operations. The familiar rhythm of daily airline life was replaced by the careful process of winding everything down. Behind every canceled flight was a much larger operation coming to an end. Gate agreements, aircraft arrangements, employee responsibilities, and business relationships all had to be managed as Spirit moved from flying passengers to closing its operations. The shutdown also represented the end of an era for an airline that had built its identity around one simple promise: keeping air travel affordable. For years, Spirit's ultra-low-cost model allowed millions of passengers to fly at prices many traditional airlines could not match. But that same model also left the company with less room to absorb major financial shocks. By the time the final flight stopped, the visible ending had arrived. But the collapse itself had happened much earlier. It was the result of years of difficult decisions, failed solutions, and shrinking options. The aircraft were still there. The employees still had the skills to operate them. Passengers still wanted affordable travel. But an airline requires more than airplanes in demand. It requires a financial foundation strong enough to keep everything moving. And for Spirit Airlines, that foundation had finally disappeared. Spirit Airlines shutdown was not simply the story of an airline that stopped flying. It was the story of how a company can continue searching for solutions, only to find each possible escape route becoming harder to reach. The JetBlue merger was supposed to change Spirit's future. That opportunity disappeared. The restructuring process offered another chance. But financial pressure continued. Fuel costs increased, additional funding became harder to secure, and the final rescue effort failed. The aircraft were still capable of flying. The employees still had the experience to operate them. The passengers still wanted affordable travel. But an airline cannot survive on airplanes and demand alone. It also requires the financial strength to keep all the pieces working together. For passengers, Spirit's ending was remembered through canceled flights and disrupted journeys. For employees, It represented the end of a company where many had built their careers. And for the aviation industry, it became another reminder that airline failures rarely happen overnight. The final flight was only the moment everyone could see. The real story had been unfolding long before that day, through decisions, financial pressures, and attempts to find one more way forward. Spirit did not stop flying because of one single mistake. It stopped because, one by one, the options that could have kept it flying disappeared.